If someone had told me that my marriage would start to crumble over something as ordinary as a night out with friends, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's the thing about life, it's never the big, dramatic moments that blindside you. It's the small shifts, the quiet cracks that grow until suddenly, everything falls apart. I'm Luke Anderson, 35 years old, living in Chicago, working as a marketing consultant. I'd been married to Sophie for 7 years. Sophie was captivating, smart, ambitious, with a laugh that could pull you in from across the room. We met at a mutual friend's party, the kind of chance encounter that feels like fate when you're young and hopeful. We fell into a rhythm quickly: date nights, spontaneous road trips, lazy Sundays spent wrapped up in each other's lives. For years, it felt like we were invincible. We had the career goals, the shared dreams, even the inside jokes that only we understood. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. It wasn't obvious at first. Sophie became distant, distracted even when she was right next to me. She'd spend more time texting on her phone than talking to me, claiming it was work stuff. She started going out with friends more often, especially to this new bar downtown called the Velvet Lantern. She'd come home late, smelling like a mix of cheap bar air and something unfamiliar. I brushed it off. Told myself we were just in a rut, that work stress was getting to both of us. Every couple hits rough patches, right? But deep down, I knew better. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. The changes in Sophie weren't immediate, they crept in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. At first, it was easy to dismiss. She'd always been independent, someone who thrived on social energy, and I loved that about her. But the excuses grew more frequent, the details fuzzier. I'm meeting Chloe and the girls for drinks, she'd say, tossing it out casually over her shoulder while heading for the door, not even waiting for me to respond. Chloe became the phantom friend I never saw, and when I asked about their meetups, Sophie's answers were vague, as if I was being intrusive for even asking. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking it. After all, we'd been married for 7 years, long enough to weather rough patches. But there's a certain kind of silence that settles between two people when something's wrong. It's not the absence of words, it's the absence of connection. One Friday evening, I decided to surprise her. She'd mentioned she was meeting Chloe at the Velvet Lantern again. It was only a few blocks from our apartment, so I thought, why not swing by, say hello, maybe even join them for a drink. Seemed harmless enough. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the low hum of chatter and the clinking of glasses. I scanned the crowd, looking for Sophie's familiar silhouette. My heart raced, not because I expected anything suspicious, but because I was excited to see her, to break the monotony of our routine. That's when I saw her, not with Chloe. She was sitting at the far end of the bar, leaning in close to a guy I didn't recognize, a bartender. He had that effortlessly confident look, tattoos creeping out from under the sleeves of his black shirt, a grin that stretched just a little too wide as he whispered something in her ear. Sophie laughed, touching his arm in a way I hadn't felt in months. My stomach twisted. I stood there, frozen, my mind scrambling for logical explanations. Maybe he's just friendly. Maybe she's being polite. But deep down, I knew better. You can't fake the kind of body language I was seeing. I didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, I turned around and walked out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. When she got home later, she acted normal, kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was. I stared at her, trying to read the face I thought I knew better than my own. How was Chloe? I asked casually. She didn't flinch. Oh, you know, same old. We just caught up, had a few drinks. Nothing exciting. That was the moment I knew she could lie without missing a beat, and that realization cut deeper than anything else. The next morning, I woke up before Sophie. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the events from the night before replaying like a broken film reel. Her laughter with the bartender echoed louder than the silence between us. Her casual kiss when she walked through the door felt different now, hollow, like it was meant to cover something up. I glanced over at her sleeping face. She looked peaceful, unaware that the fragile glass of our marriage had started to crack in ways she couldn't see. Part of me wanted to shake her awake, demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I got out of bed quietly, as if not making noise would keep the truth from feeling real. For the next few days, I became an observer in my own life. Watching her closely, picking up on details I'd ignored before. The way she'd leave her phone face down, how she'd smile at texts but never mention who they were from, the sudden uptick in girls' nights that didn't add up. I started noticing her rehearsed tone when she'd answer questions about her day, how her eyes darted slightly when she lied that I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed proof, not just suspicion. One evening, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. My heart pounded as I stared at it, debating whether to pick it up. I'd never been the jealous, snooping type. Trust had been the foundation of our marriage, or so I thought, but curiosity mixed with the gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal is a powerful thing that I unlocked her phone easily. She'd never bothered to change the passcode. My fingers trembled as I opened her messages. There it was, Liam, the bar, right near the top. I clicked it and my heart sank. Messages flooded the screen, casual at first, then more personal. Liam, last night was fun. Can't wait to see you again. Sophie, me too. Wish I didn't have to leave so soon. Liam, you didn't seem like you were in a rush last night. Sophie, you're bad. But yeah, you're right. I scrolled further, my stomach twisting with every word. They talked about meeting up, about how he doesn't suspect a thing, and even joked about how she managed to keep the story straight at home. I locked the phone and set it back exactly how I'd found it, my mind spinning. I felt nauseous, not just from what I'd read, but from the realization that the life I thought I had was built on lies. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling again, listening to her breathe, wondering how many times she'd come home to me after being with him. Wondering how long she'd been lying with that same ease. The next morning, over coffee, she acted like everything was normal. Laughing about something she'd seen online, asking me about my plans for the day. I answered automatically, my face neutral, but inside, I was unraveling that I needed to confront her. But I didn't want it to be in the heat of the moment. That I wanted her to see that I knew. That I wanted her to realize the mask was slipping, and I wanted to hear her lie to my face one last time. The day I decided to confront Sophie felt like any other on the surface: clear skies, a cool breeze drifting through the apartment, and the faint hum of city traffic below our window. But inside, I was anything but calm. My heart raced like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest, fueled by a cocktail of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. That I waited until evening. She'd come home, tossed her keys on the counter, and kicked off her shoes like she always did, acting like the world was exactly as it should be. She poured herself a glass of wine, her face lit with that easy, effortless smile, the one I used to love. But now, all I saw was the person who'd been lying to me for weeks, maybe months. Hey, I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were clenched under the table. Can we talk? She looked up, slightly surprised. Sure. What's up? I studied her for a second, then leaned back in my chair. How's Chloe? Her smile faltered for just a moment, barely noticeable, but I saw it. Oh, she's good. We met up for drinks last night, actually. Just catching up, you know. Lie number one. That I nodded slowly, pretending to believe her. At the Velvet Lantern? Yeah, she replied without hesitation, her eyes steady. Same place as usual. Lie number two. That I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the screenshots I'd taken from her messages with Liam. I slid it across the table toward her. Is this where you were? I asked quietly. Her face went pale. She didn't touch the phone, just stared at the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to guilt to something else, annoyance. You went through my phone? She snapped, her voice sharp. Not I'm sorry. Not let me explain, just deflection. That I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. You're really going to make this about me checking your phone? She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing there was no way out. After a long pause, she sighed, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not what you think," she muttered that I almost laughed. The classic line, "Oh really? Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with a bartender named Liam," I shot back, my voice rising slightly. "So if it's not what I think, why don't you explain it to me?" She hesitated, then shrugged like it was nothing. "It was just flirting. That's all. Harmless fun." "You're overreacting." Harmless fun that I felt the heat rise in my chest. "Flirting? You call meeting up with him just flirting? Texting him about how you wish you didn't have to leave? That's harmless?" Her expression hardened, like she was the one who'd been wronged. "I didn't mean for it to happen, okay? It just happened. Things have been off between us for a while, and he made me feel, don't," I cut her off, my voice low and cold now. "Don't you dare try to spin this. You could have talked to me. You could have said something. But instead, you chose to lie. To cheat." She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "What do you want me to say, Jack? That I'm a terrible person? Fine. I messed up. But maybe if you'd been more present, don't you dare put this on me," I snapped, standing up too. "This isn't about what I did or didn't do. This is about you. Your choices. Your lies." She stared at me, breathing heavily, her face flushed with frustration. After a long silence, I grabbed my keys from the counter. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice quieter now that I turned to face her one last time. "Anywhere but here." And then I walked out the door, not looking back, because I knew if I did, I might never leave. The door slammed behind me with a finality I hadn't expected. The echo lingered in my ears, but not louder than the pounding in my chest. I didn't have a destination. My feet just moved, down the stairs, onto the street, into the cool night air that felt sharp against my skin, like it was punishing me for not seeing the truth sooner. The city buzzed around me, oblivious to the implosion of my world. Cars passed, people laughed outside cafes, couples held hands. It was like life didn't care that mine had just shattered. That I ended up at a small park a few blocks from our apartment, the one Sophie and I used to walk through on lazy Sundays. We'd hold coffee cups and talk about everything and nothing, work, weekend plans, what to cook for dinner. Those conversations felt like a lifetime ago. That I sank onto a bench, the cold metal seeping through my jeans, grounding me in the moment. That's when the weight hit me, not just the betrayal but the realization that everything I thought I knew was a lie. The woman I loved, the life we'd built, it was all tainted now. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left an echo where my heart used to be. That I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen, at her name sitting there like it dared me to call. But what would I say? Why? I already knew the answer. How could you? She'd already shown me how. Instead, I opened my messages and typed 2 words to Ethan, my best friend since college. "Me, you home?" The reply came quickly. "Ethan, yeah. Everything okay?" Me, no. He didn't ask questions. He never did. That's why he was my person. 20 minutes later, I was on his couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey between us. I didn't even like whiskey, but it burned enough to distract me from the deeper ache. Ethan listened as I spilled everything, the late nights, the texts, the confrontation. I expected him to be angry on my behalf, maybe curse Sophie's name or rant about betrayal. But he didn't. He just nodded, let me vent, and when I was done, he said the simplest thing: "You didn't deserve that, man." And somehow, that hit harder than all the anger in the world. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of walking into that apartment, seeing her things, breathing the same air, it was suffocating. I crashed at Ethan's, cycling through waves of rage, sadness, and something worse, numbness. Sophie called. A lot. Texted even more. I didn't answer. I didn't delete the messages either. I read them over and over, trying to find a shred of sincerity hidden between the apologies. Sophie, I'm sorry. Please, can we talk? Sophie, I didn't mean for it to happen. Sophie, I miss you. I love you. Please come home. Love? That word felt like an insult now. One evening, fueled by too much whiskey and not enough sleep, I picked up her call. Jack, she breathed into the phone, like my name was oxygen. That I didn't say anything. Just listened. I miss you. I hate how things ended. Can we please talk? Face to face? Just, please. I almost hung up, but part of me needed answers. Closure. Or maybe just confirmation that she wasn't the person I thought she was. So, I agreed. Tomorrow, I said, my voice hollow. I'll come by. When I hung up, Ethan gave me a look. You sure about that? I wasn't. But I nodded anyway, because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to face what broke you head on. The next day felt like walking toward a storm I knew would swallow me whole. Every step closer to our apartment felt heavier, like gravity itself wanted to pull me back. But I kept going. Not because I wanted to fix anything, there was nothing left to fix, but because I needed to see her face when the lies couldn't hide behind a screen anymore. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over the doorknob longer than I'd like to admit. My heart wasn't racing like I expected. Instead, there was this unsettling calm, like the numbness had built walls around whatever was left of me. I pushed the door open. Sophie was sitting on the couch, the same spot where we'd shared countless quiet mornings, where she'd laughed at my bad jokes, where I thought we'd built a life. Now it just felt like a stranger's house. She stood up quickly, her eyes wide, searching my face for, what? Forgiveness? Hope? There was none left. Jack, she whispered, like my name was fragile. I didn't respond. Just closed the door behind me and stood there, letting the silence stretch between us like a chasm. She stepped closer, wringing her hands. I didn't think you'd come. I said I would, I replied flatly, my voice sounding foreign even to me. She hesitated, then motioned toward the couch. Can we sit? I stayed standing. She sighed, running her fingers through her hair, clearly flustered by my lack of reaction. I know I hurt you. I hate what I did. I wasn't thinking straight, I felt lost, disconnected. Liam was just, don't, I cut her off sharply. Don't you dare make this about feeling lost. You knew exactly what you were doing. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. If words could hurt her even a fraction of how she'd hurt me, good. It wasn't serious, she blurted out. It didn't mean anything. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Funny how it didn't mean anything, but you risked everything for it. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. You lied to my face, Sophie. Over and over. You looked me in the eyes and pretended we were fine. Do you know how that feels? My voice cracked, the rage mixing with something softer, grief, maybe. She started crying then, real tears, but they felt hollow. I'd seen her cry before, when her dad passed away, when we lost our first dog, during sappy movies. But this? This wasn't grief. It was guilt, and guilt isn't love. I'm sorry, she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I was stupid. I thought it was just excitement, something different. But it didn't mean I stopped loving you. I stared at her, trying to find the woman I married under all the lies. But she wasn't there. Just someone who looked like her. If you loved me, I said quietly, you wouldn't have done it. She sobbed harder, but I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just emptiness. That I picked up my bag from where I'd dropped it by the door. Where are you going? She choked out. Somewhere I don't feel like a fool, I replied, and with that, I walked out again. Only this time, it felt like I was finally walking away for good. Leaving felt different this time. Not like the first time when I stormed out fueled by raw rage and disbelief. This time it was quieter, more deliberate. The door didn't slam, I just closed it softly behind me, like sealing off a room filled with memories I didn't need anymore. That I walked without a destination, letting my feet carry me through streets that felt too familiar. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, people laughing, neon lights blinking like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Eventually, I found myself outside Ethan's apartment. No text, no call. I just showed up, and when he opened the door, he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stepped aside and let me in. I sank onto his old, worn-out couch, the same one we'd spilled beers on during college, the same one where I crashed after long nights out. Funny how life circles back to the places you started when you're broken. How'd it go? Ethan finally asked, sitting across from me, his voice low. I stared at the floor, my hands resting on my knees. She cried, I muttered. Said she was sorry. Said it didn't mean anything. Ethan scoffed softly, shaking his head. People don't ruin lives over things that don't mean anything. Exactly. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought seeing her would give me some kind of closure. Like maybe I'd get the answers I needed. But it didn't. I just felt empty. Ethan didn't try to fill the silence with clichés. He just sat there, letting me sit with it, which was exactly what I needed. The next few days blurred together. I stayed at Ethan's place, not ready to face the apartment filled with her fingerprints. Every time I thought about going back, I pictured the couch where she confessed, the kitchen where we used to dance while cooking, the bed we shared, all tainted. Sophie kept texting, Sophie, I miss you. Please come home. Sophie, I'm so sorry. Can't we talk? Sophie, I still love you. Doesn't that mean something? Love. That word used to mean everything. Now it felt cheap, thrown around like it could patch the hole she'd torn through me. One night, I finally replied. Me, love isn't supposed to feel like this. I didn't send anything else. Eventually, I knew I had to go back, not to reconcile, not to forgive, but to reclaim my space, to face the ghosts she left behind. When I opened the door to our apartment, it hit me like a punch. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly, mixed with the stale air of a place left untouched. Photos still hung on the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, mocking me with memories of a life that never really existed. I walked through each room like a stranger, touching things that once felt like home. I packed a bag, not just with clothes, but with pieces of myself I wanted to salvage. The photo albums went untouched. They belonged to a version of me I didn't recognize anymore. Before I left, I found myself standing in front of our wedding photo. We looked so happy, so sure. I stared at it for a long time, then quietly took it off the wall and turned it face down on the floor. When I closed the door behind me, it felt final, not the end of a chapter, the end of the whole book, and I was finally ready to start writing a new one. Moving on isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like dragging yourself through a field of broken glass. Every step hurts, but staying still is worse. After leaving the apartment, I found a small place across town, a one-bedroom with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it was mine. No ghosts in the walls, no echoes of laughter that had turned into lies. The first night alone was the hardest. I sat on the floor because I didn't have furniture yet, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The silence was deafening. I thought about turning on the TV, but what was the point? The noise wouldn't drown out the thoughts. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos out of habit, pictures of Sophie and me at the beach, laughing at a barbecue, sitting on the couch with our dog, Max, who she took when I left. I stared at those photos, trying to connect with the version of myself who smiled in them. But he felt like a stranger. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I deleted them, every single one. Not out of spite, but because holding onto them felt like trying to breathe underwater. Days turned into weeks. I built new routines, waking up early, running even though I hated it, cooking simple meals, filling the space with anything that didn't remind me of her. Ethan checked in constantly, dragging me out to bars and introducing me to people I didn't care to meet. But I went because sitting alone felt worse. One night, we ended up at a dive bar across town. Dim lights, sticky floors, the kind of place where no one cares who you are. I sat at the bar, nursing a beer, staring at nothing, when someone sat down next to me. Her name was Hannah. She wasn't flashy or overly confident. She just ordered her drink and glanced over with a casual, "Rough day?" I laughed, "A real one." Something like that. We talked. Not about love or heartbreak. Just life. Music. Bad movies. The best tacos in the city. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. It felt good to be just Jack, not Jack, the guy whose wife cheated. We exchanged numbers, but I didn't expect much. The next day, she texted, "Hannah, hope you survived the world's worst dive bar. Coffee sometime?" I stared at the message, unsure if I was ready. But then I realized, I'd never be ready. Healing isn't a destination. It's a process. So, I replied. Me, sure. Coffee sounds good. Meeting Hannah wasn't a movie moment. There were no sparks flying or dramatic declarations. It was just coffee. But for the first time in months, I wasn't looking backward. Later that night, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, I realized something. The ache was still there, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. It was just part of the story, and I was finally ready to write the next chapter. Meeting Hannah wasn't some grand, cinematic moment that instantly healed me. It was small, simple, two people sitting across from each other in a cozy cafe with chipped mugs and lopsided tables. But sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest difference. She smiled when I walked in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't carrying my past like a heavy backpack. She didn't know about Sophie, didn't see me as a guy defined by betrayal. I was just Jack, the guy she met in a dive bar, ordering cheap beer and mumbling about bad music. We talked about everything except relationships. Movies we loved, books we never finished, weird jobs we'd had in college. She had this easy way about her, no pretense, no hidden agenda. Just, genuine. And that was refreshing. When I left that cafe, I didn't feel fireworks or butterflies. What I felt was better, calm. Like maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Over the next few weeks, we met up more. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into long walks around the city. She never pushed, never pried. And that's what made it easy. There was no pressure to be better or healed. I could just exist. But healing isn't linear. One night, I was back in my apartment, flipping through an old notebook I'd packed without thinking. Tucked between the pages was a photo I'd missed, a candid shot of Sophie and me at a friend's wedding, laughing at something stupid. It hit me like a punch. I stared at it for a long time, that familiar ache creeping in. How did we get from that moment to this? The betrayal, the lies, the emptiness. I felt the urge to text her, to ask why again, as if any answer could make it make sense. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I didn't do it. Instead, I picked up the photo, ripped it in half, and tossed it in the trash, not out of anger, but because it didn't belong in my story anymore. The next time I saw Hannah, she noticed something was different. "You okay?" she asked, her head tilted slightly, her eyes soft. I nodded. "Yeah. Actually, yeah, I think I am." She smiled, and it wasn't just polite, it was understanding. Even though she didn't know the details, that night, I realized something important. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about making peace with it. Letting it be a chapter, not the whole book. I wasn't over it. I probably never would be completely, but I was finally moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Time moved differently after that, faster in some ways, slower in others. The days felt lighter, even if the shadows of the past still lingered. My routine became my anchor: early mornings with coffee, late evenings with quiet walks, sporadic texts from Hannah sprinkled in between. She wasn't a distraction, she was a reminder that life existed beyond betrayal. But there was one thing left, a loose thread I hadn't pulled: Sophie. I hadn't seen her since the day I walked out of our apartment, hadn't responded to her texts or calls. She'd stopped reaching out weeks ago, and that silence spoke louder than any apology. But something gnawed at me, not anger, not regret, just an unfinished sentence in a chapter one wasn't sure I wanted to reread that I didn't plan it. One afternoon, I found myself near our old apartment. My feet carried me there before my mind could catch up. The building looked the same, indifferent to the lives that unraveled inside it. That I stood across the street, staring at the window that used to be ours. For a moment, I wondered if she'd be there, maybe glance out and see me standing like a ghost from our past. But she didn't. And that was okay. That I didn't go inside. That I didn't need to, because I realized something standing there on that cold sidewalk. Closure doesn't come from confronting someone. It comes from accepting that you'll never get the answers you think you need. That I walked away, and this time, it wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors, no bitter words left hanging in the air. Just footsteps fading into the city noise, leaving the past where it belonged, behind me. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the ceiling. No tears, no tightness in my chest. Just peace. That I grabbed my notebook, flipping to the last page, and wrote, "Closure isn't about them. It's about you deciding the story is over." I closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer, not because I'd forgotten, but because I no longer needed to remember. Hannah texted me an hour later, "Hannah, you still owe me a rematch in Scrabble." I smiled, not because life was perfect but because it was mine again, and that was enough. The days that followed felt different, not like everything was magically fixed, but like I'd finally stepped out of a fog. The memories of Sophie weren't gone, but they no longer had sharp edges. They were just there, like old postcards from places I'd visited but had no desire to return to. Hannah and I grew closer, not because I needed her to fill the void Sophie left, but because she didn't try to. She didn't ask about my past unless I offered it, and when I did, she listened without trying to fix me. There was no pressure to be anything other than what I was, a man still figuring things out. One evening, we found ourselves back at that same dive bar where we first met. It felt surreal sitting there again, like life had come full circle. The neon lights flickered overhead, the same terrible music played, and the bartender still looked like he hated his job. But I was different. "You seem lighter," Hannah said, sipping her drink, her eyes studying me over the rim of her glass. That I shrugged, smiling softly. Maybe because I finally let go of something I should have dropped a long time ago. She didn't press. Just nodded, understanding in that quiet way she always did. After a pause, I added, "You know, for a long time, I thought closure meant having one last conversation, getting answers. But it's not about that. It's about deciding that the past doesn't get to control you anymore." She leaned back, her smile genuine. "Sounds like you've been doing some thinking." I laughed. "Too much, probably." We left the bar and walked through the city, the cool night air refreshing. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. Just the sound of our footsteps on the pavement, the occasional brush of our hands, the comfort of simply being. At one point, we stopped by the river, watching the city lights reflect off the water. I turned to her, feeling the weight of everything I'd carried finally ease. "Thank you," I said quietly. She glanced over, her brow raised slightly. "For what?" I shrugged. "For showing me that there's life after all of it." She didn't respond with words. She just smiled, took my hand, and squeezed it gently. That small gesture meant more than anything. Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat on my couch, the same one that used to feel too big and too empty. But not anymore. It felt like mine. That I opened my notebook one last time. The pages were filled with anger, heartbreak, confusion. But this time, I wrote something different. The past is a chapter. Not the whole book. And I'm finally ready to write the next one. I closed the notebook, not with sadness, but with gratitude, not for what happened but for what it taught me. Because sometimes, the most beautiful part of your story starts after you think it's over. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that night, but it felt real. And sometimes, that's better than perfect. The ache that once sat heavy in my chest had faded into something quieter, a memory instead of a wound. Hannah and I kept seeing each other, not because I needed to replace Sophie, but because I didn't need to. She wasn't a rebound or a patch for the broken parts of me. She was just Hannah, funny, kind, sharp-witted, with a way of making the simplest moments feel meaningful. One lazy Sunday morning, we sat in my apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor. She was curled up on the couch, her coffee mug balanced on her knee, flipping through one of my old photo albums she'd found tucked away on a shelf. She paused on a photo of Sophie and my chest tightened for a split second, but then I exhaled. It didn't hurt, not the way it used to. Is this her? Hannah asked gently, not prying, just acknowledging that I nodded. Yeah. That's Sophie. She didn't make it awkward. She just closed the album, set it aside, and said, "You've come a long way, you know." And for the first time, I believed it. Later that day, after she left, I found myself standing in front of that same shelf. I picked up the photo album, flipped through the pages filled with snapshots of a life that felt like someone else's story. Instead of sadness, I felt appreciation. Not for the betrayal, but for the lessons it taught me, about love, about resilience, about myself. That I packed the album away, not out of bitterness, but because it belonged to the past. That night, as I sat alone with a glass of whiskey, I opened my notebook, just one last time. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to live with it without letting it define you. I closed the notebook, not with the heaviness of grief, but with the lightness of acceptance, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a life I was finally ready to live, on my own terms. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but comforting. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself loudly but slowly unfolds in quiet mornings, casual conversations, and evenings spent under soft lights rather than harsh memories. That I no longer measured my days by what had been lost, but by what I had found. One crisp autumn morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting long, warm streaks across my small apartment. The space that once felt too empty now felt just right, mine, filled with echoes of new laughter, not ghosts from the past. That I made a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city stir awake. The streets below were busy, people hustling to wherever life was pulling them. It hit me then, how far I'd come. Not in distance, but in heart. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Hannah, sending a picture of the worst-looking latte art I'd ever seen with the caption, "I think it's supposed to be a heart, or maybe a squirrel." I chuckled, my heart lighter than it had been in a long time. I replied with a simple, "Definitely a squirrel." 2/10 effort. Setting my phone down, I glanced at the drawer where my old notebook lived. I hadn't opened it in weeks, not because I'd forgotten, but because I didn't need it anymore. Still, something nudged me to pull it out, to flip through the pages one last time. There it was, my journey etched in ink. Pages filled with heartbreak, confusion, anger, and slowly, acceptance. Every word was a piece of me, raw and unfiltered. That I turned to the very last page, the final blank space, and wrote, "Some chapters don't end with closure. They end when you stop needing it. And that's enough." I closed the notebook gently, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet acknowledgement that it had served its purpose. I tucked it back into the drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to survival. Later that evening, as the sky melted into shades of orange and pink, I met Hannah at our favorite cafe. She was already there, laughing at something the barista said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She saw me and waved, that same effortless smile lighting up her face. And in that moment, I realized, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. That I was defined by what I chose to find, myself. And that was the real story all along.